Thank you for joining us today at City Club's May 20th Friday Forum. I'm Sharon Van Sickle-Robbins, President of City Club, and I would like to welcome you all, those of you here with us today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio, or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Today's speakers are going to discuss the future of human services delivery in Oregon, but first a few announcements. To begin with, if you haven't already turned your cell phones off, you might want to do that now. Next, we're joined today by a number of new members. We've been doing our new member drive, and a lot of them are here today. And I wanted to recognize Crystal Frombling, who is from the School of Social Work at Portland State University, Pamela Fedderson, Tim Nesbitt, David St. John, who's an auctioneer, and Father Rick Gans from Marylhurst University. If you would all stand, we would like to welcome you. And we also have a special guest with us today. Governor Ted Kulongoski is joining us today. Welcome. You should have all, those of you who are members, have all received the latest of our research study reports, the PERS report, which came out just yesterday. If you haven't seen it yet, there are copies at the back of the room. It's very provocative, and I encourage you to take a look at it. We'll be actually voting on that report at June 3rd's Friday Forum. City Club's corporate and media partners are also vital to supporting our club activities, and I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine. I'd like to offer appreciation to our Friday Forum corporate sponsors. Please join me in offering our sincere appreciation to our spring quarter sponsors, communications firm Morel Inc., utility company Northwest Natural, and the law firms of Perkins Coie and Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt. We are truly grateful for your support. If your company or firm would like to be a City Club sponsor, you can contact City Club staff at the back of the room or call the City Club offices. Now, once again today, we're going to be experimenting with something a little different during the question and answer period. You'll see that on every table are pens and index cards. During the forum, we invite you to write any questions that you have for our speakers on these cards. You don't have to be a City Club member to submit a question. And then during the board host question today, City Club staff will collect the cards and select some of the best questions, which I'll read from the microphone. City Club members are still welcome to come to the microphone to ask their questions during Q&A, and we're sure that you're going to come up with some great questions for today's speakers. And now to today's program. With the economic slump, Oregon's human services sectors can no longer afford business as usual. Finding creative and effective ways to serve more people with fewer dollars is an ongoing struggle. Governor Kitzhaber declared that the state must shift priorities from addressing problems after they have developed to preventing them in the first place. His budget, released in February, reflects this view. But how will this shift in priorities play out in real life? What are the new and innovative ways that we can deliver corrections and human services? Can we ensure that Oregonians receive equal or greater value for each tax dollar? And how will these changes impact the future of Oregon? Today, a panel of experts will attempt to answer these and I'm sure other challenging questions. Our first speaker today will be Ben DeHaan. For more than 30 years, Ben has brought together leaders and policymakers in academia, child welfare, and justice systems in order to create change and improve the lives of vulnerable children, adults, and families. Prior to assuming his current position as Executive Director at Partners for Our Children, Ben directed child welfare services for the state of Oregon and served there in a variety of leadership positions for nearly 20 years. He has also led 2 university-based research centers, was the founding president of the Children's Justice Alliance, and is a former director for the Oregon Department of Corrections. Today's second speaker will be Erinn Kelley-Siel. In May, the Oregon Senate confirmed her as Director of the Department of Human Services after she served for more than 2 years as the Assistant Director of the DHS Children, Adults, and Families Division. Prior to joining DHS, she served as Governor Kulongoski's Human Services Advisor, where she provided guidance on reducing Oregon's hunger rate, strengthening protection for children in Oregon's child welfare system, and transforming Oregon's public mental health system. She previously served at the law firm Stoll Reeves and as a law clerk to then Justice Kulongoski at the Oregon Supreme Court. Today's final speaker will be Lynne Saxton. As the Chief Executive Officer for Christie Care, she oversees this $11 million organization that provides children's mental health services throughout the state. She's worked closely with Governor Kitzhaber since 2010 on early childhood issues, was co-chair of his Early Childhood and Family Investment Team, and currently serves as chair on the governor's Early Learning Design Team. Lynne previously served on the board of directors for the Neuropsychiatric Institute at Oregon Health and Science University, and she currently sits on the Oregon Children's Mental Health System Advisory Committee. And without further ado, please help me welcome our first speaker, Ben DeHaan. Ben?
Good afternoon. I hope you weren't expecting Max Williams here instead of me. There was an announcement that went out that said that the director of the Department of Corrections would be here, so I just want to make sure on the record that no, I am not Max Williams. I'm definitely Ben DeHaan. As you heard from the announcement about my conversation with you today, I've served in a number of different capacities over the years in the state of Oregon. My home now is at the University of Washington. And one of the things that I've spending a lot of my time doing these days is trying to sort out how well human service systems work, and when they don't work well, what to do about it. It's a research center, but it's also what I've tended to call a boundary organization. It's an organization that works in the intersections between the normal organizations that you would expect to be involved in human services. They are normally, you would expect, public agencies and philanthropy. So what I'd like to do today is to share a couple of ideas with you, and then I'd like to give you some specific steps that I think anybody organizing human services, whether it's in Oregon or any place else, should consider. Unfortunately, most of the discussions I've been involved with and the discussions that I've observed devolve into this question of whether or not services should be local, statewide, private, or public. That's an issue that I think distracts everybody from the central theme of quality, and it's one that I would suggest as we talk about that we not get overly engaged in. Excuse me, if you take a look at the human services system here in Oregon and in America, you'll see that over time it changes from that mix, that blend of public and private. And if you look at larger systems in the, say for example in Canada and the UK, you'll see that that blend always changes, and it's really not an issue that we should spend a lot of time on. The big players in human services are not-for-profits, government, and private philanthropies. Last time I checked, there were 250,000 private philanthropies in America, most of which are, they don't really get an idea of how it is that they can involve in human services. If you think about the private investment, for example, at the global level, you can see that many of the people that I work with and many of the folks that I interact with are capable of affecting human services at a very, very large level, definitely on the global level. One of the things that we also hear a lot about, and many of you in the public sector have heard this as well, is why not just run it as a business? Why not run human services as a business? I heard that constantly when I was either at the Department of Corrections or in other places. The reason that that won't work is because government actually, as we all know, has monopolistic interests. They do things that are very difficult, and other organizations can't do that. So why are our human services organized the way that they are? The answer is that they generally follow, as you all know, categorical funding streams, and that level of flexibility is something that that obviously leads to us giving families what we have rather than what they need. So if we wanted to design a human services strategy from scratch, what are the kinds of things that we would want to include in that? The first thing would be to sort out a way of having this human service system organized around collective impact. The 1.4 million not-for-profits that I've talked about already, when you think about it, they're all organized around individual impact, specific service populations, and they obviously are very competitive with one another. So if we're moving forward in a way that's constructive, we would want to develop consortia that were not as competitive as they are today. The next issue is we have to figure out a way to get a better fit between what we offer and what families need. I just finished a study, this one happens to be in Washington. I just finished a study in which we interviewed 1,000 families and took a look at the entire service array for the state of Washington. And what we found is that there's a very, very poor fit between the services that families desire and need and what it is that the state up there actually offers. The third issue is we need a different approach to managing data. I just came back from Yale University a couple of weeks ago where 100 of us sat around a room talking about this question of interoperability. That is to say, why are the human services systems collecting data that are all organized around a specific purpose and that aren't being shared very well? You've all heard about, well, I don't know if you know the term SACWIS, but a very large standalone data system in child welfare, I think, is a very good example. From the minute these systems are implemented, they're obsolete. They're very expensive. They run between $50 million and $100 million a year. Yet Annie E. Casey, a national foundation, just developed an alternative that runs on the internet. It's web-based, and it looks a lot more like Facebook than it does your standalone systems that the state spends so much money on. So moving forward, as you design a human services system, interoperability is a term that most people use in the construction of these data systems. Cloud computing, all the things that the high-tech folks are thinking about need to find their way into the government approach to these kinds of services. The next thing, paying attention to outcomes. That's something that's well worn. But when I worked for a private philanthropy, one of my jobs was to give away about $130 million a year. And what normally happened, what I normally received, were requests to plug holes in individual state budgets. So if you're trying to deal with philanthropy, if you want people to invest in your human services systems, the thing that you've got to be able to do is to draw a direct correlation between the dollars that they invest and what the outcomes are that people expect. And you hear that more rhetorically in the language than you actually find when you talk to people. Next item, implementation science is what the researchers call it, but the bottom line is getting things done. Human service systems are very large, they're very complicated, and they're very difficult to turn around. We have examples here of people who are running these systems who are doing an excellent job, but the reality is that we have a pretty good idea of what works in human services. We have a very poor idea of the steps that we have to take in order to make these systems respond to human needs and to respond to the needs of the public. The next item, boundary organizations. Erinn and others will be talking about the silo effects that categorical funding streams in human services create. And I spent a lot of my adult life trying to create change in bureaucracies, but there are organizations outside the system that are very good at that as well. And creating these sort of public purpose organizations or boundary organizations is, I think, a very effective strategy for getting some of the things done within between the areas that overlap in existing agencies. For example, a child welfare worker really should have a good comprehension of and understanding of the economic needs of a family. the correctional officer in the housing block at the state penitentiary bears some responsibility for the family members of that inmate post-release. So the whole idea of working in those boundaries between these large organizations is something that private philanthropy is very adept at and very interested in if we could learn the language to bring the private sector to the table to operate in that space. We need to talk about human services in a way that's much more accessible than the way that we do it now. I was in Chicago last weekend, and we were, a lot of people were at the table, the vice president of the National Basketball Association, chief operating officer for Macy's Corporation, global corporations sitting around the table, asking me and others, what is it that we can do? Because when they talk to social workers and public sector folks, they can't get a handle on what it is that we could ask of them. So the way we talk about our organizations, the way we talk about families' needs, we have to learn how to speak to a different group of people than we've been adept at speaking to so far. This is probably a very unpopular thing to say right now, given the financial condition of the state of Oregon, but the reality is that funding isn't the only issue we want to be concerned about when we think about services. It's been my experience that some of the most ineffective organizations that I've been around have been the best funded. And one thing is true, I know we're facing some terrible cuts right now, but one thing is true, it is causing people to move away from the assumptions that they've been comfortable with for a long time, and it does precipitate change in many respects. That's not to say that we want a financial crisis in order to do this, but the way that we organize human services today is not the way that we organized it even 30 years ago, and it's not the way the rest of the world organizes it. So the point I'm making here is that funding alone will not create quality human services, that there has to be a finer screen than that. And I think I'm just about out of time now, so is that right? So we have the next speaker, Erinn. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Well, hopefully I won't be too repetitive of Max. I'm just kidding. So there's a quote that I have on my wall that's Albert Einstein quote, and it says, "The significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them." And I think that's part of what we're talking about today, is getting to a different level of thinking and really having different kinds of conversations. And so I'm going to piggyback a little bit on some of Ben's comments and share with you some perspective that I've had working in Oregon government, coming in from the outside. When I was appointed, this is sort of funny, somebody in a newspaper said that I was a Salem insider. And I thought that was really funny because I really haven't been around that long, as you can probably see. But it has been a privilege to serve, and I do it because I do believe government can make a difference in the lives of people, but I also believe we can't do that alone. And I really want to endorse the things that Ben said, that we have to develop a collective will around a common set of expectations and outcomes in order to have the impact that I think we all want to be able to have in people's lives and our communities. At DHS, the Department of Human Services, which I now run, we serve over 1 million Oregonians every year. And we do that with 90% of our multi-billion-dollar budget going out in the form of payments or resources that support private and nonprofit businesses and agencies. And so although we are a large organization with a large budget, I think the impression people often have of us is that we have thousands of staff. We do, but that most of our money isn't being invested in ourselves, and that's in fact not true. We actually support the economic development across Oregon that you see, and in fact the conversation we're having often right now about our reductions are the job loss that will happen in the private sector as a result of reductions in human service programs. And I think those are important things to talk about, but I would wholeheartedly agree with Ben that I don't think that focusing on government versus private is the right focus. I think we have to do this work together. if we're going to be successful. And our mission at DHS is to help people to be safe and to live as independently as possible. Ultimately, our goal, if you will, is to put ourselves out of business. We would like to be so successful at what we do that people no longer need us and we could go away. We do face some incredible challenges, and I believe, as Ben said, that in those challenges, in the midst of that challenge, there is a lot of opportunity. And that's really what I want to focus my remarks on today. You know, currently, multiple state and local government entities all have different, loosely coordinated, and often competing delivery systems. Those are state, regional, and local programs, competing programs, and competing priority outcomes. Across the state, I really want to emphasize this, there is really excellent work being done, but most often that excellence is achieved in spite of some of the construct of complexity that we've put together around our systems and the people who are in them. I think the time has really come to have some courageous conversations, and Ben's focused his remarks a little bit around some reflection on the philanthropic community and how many of them there are and how maybe building a consortium and some collective will with them would be great. I think it behooves us as government to do a couple of things. One, across agencies, we have to have some agreement that we will jointly be accountable for results on a limited number of high priority outcomes. Our footprint right now is too big. We do too much, and as a result, it dilutes our efficacy. I think people struggle to understand completely what it is that we do, and because we're not all talking about what we do in similar language and around a similar set of goals, we're not able ourselves always to articulate the results that we're getting on behalf of Oregonians. In order to have the discipline around a set of goals, you also have to have a common policy and investment framework. And that framework can't just be about government. It has to be inclusive of the private and nonprofit and the philanthropic sectors. And it also has to be a framework that we all agree we will stick to for the next 5 to 10 years if we're going to achieve the outcomes that we've identified as our priorities. One of the things that's true about our society today is that we really thrive on instant gratification. We get information instantly. We have a sense that results should be instantaneous. And while I think we can get results faster, and we often take too long to get there because we're diluted, as I said, I also think the kind of transformative change that we're trying to really be talking about here today is going to take some sustained commitment over time to get to. Government also has to be willing, across all sectors, to streamline, simplify, and redesign our administrative and service delivery models. We need to collapse, repurpose where appropriate, duplicative layers. And I know people talk about this critically often, and that's okay. It's fair to be critical, but I think it's also important to take a few minutes, which I won't do today, but just to learn about how we got to where we are. Everyone with well-intended purpose, I think, has created where we are today. And I think that well-intended purpose can serve us well as we undo some things. We need to recognize what's working first and then say, how do we get ourselves to the next level and reset? Our work in DHS is focused on a couple of things. So as we're streamlining and becoming more effective, we're also charged to protect the most vulnerable people, mitigate costs so we don't shift them into higher cost services. We have tons of disparities around people of color, rural communities, and people living in poverty that we're trying to remedy. And we are working on prioritizing our investments in more proactive, preventive human service delivery models. Those same themes have really, I think, played out in multiple conversations over the last decade, at least since I've been engaged in the discussions. And based on my review of both their successes and failures, there are a couple of things. I'll give another list like Ben did, and you can cross-compare ours and maybe merge them together. We didn't compare notes beforehand. But I think if we're going to be successful right now to leverage this opportunity into true transformation around human service delivery, we've got to tackle a couple of key things. We need leadership at the highest levels across systems, not just one leader, but multiple leaders across multiple layers of the systems that have been created to commit to a shared vision for change that spans multiple biennia. We don't have a great history of doing that. It's hard in a political environment where people change over frequently and where the leadership, like people in my positions, can change at a moment's notice because of a bad story in the newspaper. We need that sustained commitment by government to the identified priorities in the common agenda. We need recognition that to be successful, the effort has to go beyond government and include the private, nonprofit, faith-based, and philanthropic sectors. We need to have joint ownership for a holistic approach to the needs of Oregonians, inclusive of education, employment, and human services. These are not mutually exclusive systems, and we need to be talking about them more together because they are interrelated. This is really critical, this next point. We need responsibility with authority in one place. As we talk about outcomes and accountability for those, one of the challenges, and I'll give you an example, is that we have multiple agencies, multiple entities who are currently responsible even for the places where we have common goals. So around the health and safety of children, I am not the only person in my administration of DHS where I have responsibility for programs that help families be independent and programs that help kids be safe. I'm not the only person, though, who ultimately determines the outcome for a child and family's life. I work closely with those folks who work with addiction treatment programs, those folks who work in mental health programs, domestic violence programs, sometimes the correction system, often the education system, and the employment systems in order to have a successful outcome for that family. But at the end of the day, somebody who controls the resource that can be invested in that family needs to be the one who can be responsible for the decisions that have been made and the outcomes that have been achieved. And right now, we spread that responsibility out quite a bit. So at the end of the day, it's really hard to say, I got this outcome for this investment. That causal relationship that Ben spoke to is hard to achieve when there isn't responsibility with authority around the common goals. I will not repeat what Ben said about information, but if we're going to become a performance-based, data-driven operation to a different level than where we are today, we need better data systems that talk to each other, and we need less regulation around the kinds of things we can share. We need an incentive-based accountability model. There's a lot of talk always about accountability, but today our structure is very punitive. When an agency isn't successful at achieving an outcome, including a community-based agency, the question that I get asked is, why do you continue contracting with that entity? Well, why aren't we asking the question, what can we do to support that entity to get a different result? I think it's fair that people need chance, especially as we're taking risk and transforming systems. People need an opportunity to be successful. And in today's conversation about accountability, we tend to employ the hammer more than we employ the support and carrot approach. I've talked about the issue of alignment, and I want to say too that even though I don't think we should spend a lot of time on defining who is most responsible for what pieces of the system, I do think we need clarity together about our roles and responsibilities, especially within the publicly funded systems. I don't think we have that today, and I think that creates some of the duplication that frustrates people. And finally, this is a personal passion for me. We need to make a commitment together to equitable results across the state. We have some really gross inequities right now, and when you look at the inverse relationship of things like access to education or health care for people of color in the state, and then the overuse of systems like foster care and corrections, there's an exact proportionate relationship, and we need to be having that conversation so that we can shift our investment framework from an investment in corrections and in child welfare toward an investment in education and employment opportunities. I'll spend my last moment mentioning one example specifically in DHS that I'm working with the legislature right now to try and effectuate. This builds off of what Lynne will speak to a bit in terms of the governor's early learning agenda, but as I mentioned earlier, I currently have responsibility for families and for children and family programs, specifically programs around the issues of abuse and neglect, safety, our child welfare foster care system. Most of you become familiar with that system when we have a bad outcome and something's gone wrong on behalf of a child. Last year alone, there were over 11,000 children in the state who were abused, and our system responded to over 71,000 calls reporting abuse or neglect. Child abuse and neglect is a very serious issue. When you drill down into the data and information about why it's happening, it really comes down to a couple of things. It comes down to families not having the ability to meet their basic needs, becoming very stressed, and resorting to things like alcohol and drugs, and also then having interpersonal relationships that are unhealthy. That's really what abuse and neglect in the state is about. And we deal more in this state with neglect than we do with physical or sexual abuse. If you look at the percentages of kids who we're working with in the child welfare system, most of them have not been physically or sexually abused, which is not the common perception. So as we've looked at that data and information in child welfare, and we've talked with families and spent time listening to what their needs are, as Ben said, our system currently isn't designed at all to keep families whole. So for the last 2.5 years, we've embarked on a very critical partnership with community. Mickey Lansing is here from the Commission on Children and Families. She's been instrumental and extremely helpful with her leadership around this initiative. We've also been partnering with the philanthropic sector, Casey Family Programs, around an effort specifically to safely and equitably reduce the number of children in Oregon in foster care. We've been successful. We've reduced foster care in the state in the last several years by about 10%. And we've done that keeping children safe. So there is less re-abuse of children that come to the attention of child welfare today than there was a couple of years ago. We think we're just on the cutting edge of being able to take this to the next level, and that's the last piece I'll talk about, which is really true transformation of the child welfare system, away from a system that is child rescue based and toward a system that is family preservation based. We call the model differential or alternative response. Its name explains itself. It's really about a different kind of partnership with community-based organizations from the time child welfare receives a phone call and the time then that we go out to investigate whether a child has been abused or neglected. Rather than approach it from the perspective of an investigation, we would like instead to be going out and offering families supportive services that keep them whole and allow them to protect and keep their children safe, rather than have the government come in, remove the child, and have the child and the family experience the trauma of removal, and then cascade into what is a $26,000 per year financial investment of our state per child in foster care. We think with a minimal investment up front in community-based organizations who can work differently with child welfare workers who will have to approach their work very differently, we think we can keep more kids safely in their own homes, in communities, being more successful in school, being healthier with their families, and avoid not just the cost of foster care, but the accelerated cost that then follows around what often happens, which is they fail in school, they become involved in the juvenile justice system, and ultimately as adults they're not tax-paying and employed citizens, but they sometimes end up homeless or in our correction system. I've run out of time, but I do want to emphasize that there is opportunity in the midst of this crisis, but it is going to require all of us to come together and make some sacrifice around our turf and around the way we've thought about things in the past. So I appreciate the chance to be here today, and I look forward to now hearing from Lynne, who's someone on the ground working to get this done with us in communities.
I hope you're as excited as I am, because I think there's tremendous congruence here in terms of an assessment of the problem and an assessment of the opportunity and what we do to move the ball down the field. So I think that's very exciting. I want to start with my operating premises today, one of which is, as a fifth-generation Oregonian, I have high expectations. I was raised here to have high expectations. I had 4 grandparents, each of whom left in grade school to go get jobs to support their families, and never returned to formalized education after that, because they were working so hard to set high expectations for their children. And I think that's what those of us in Oregon need to revisit, are those high expectations. Even in this fiscal crisis, even in the challenges that confront us, We should be setting our expectations higher and using all the tools of the 21st century to be sure that we achieve those expectations. And let me give you some examples. First of all, we accept, and I think you're hearing today, 2008 was a reset. You can call it a depression or recession. I've heard it called everything, but I choose to call it a reset because I think that's the most optimistic language we can find. Failure to acknowledge that 2008 was a reset delays change, delays achieving high expectations because we keep wanting to think that there just might be that much money again in the world, or there just might be that amount of resource. And the sooner we accept that the world was changed and that we as creative, intelligent, high expectation people need to find solutions for children and families in crisis, the faster we can get on about doing that. So let me give you two examples. First, I want to talk about differential response. The governor, in setting the early learning design team, which early learning, just for all of you, is the 0 to 5 population. It's my pleasure to announce today that 45,000 babies are born in Oregon every year. And for those of us who love babies and children, that's just great news. The challenge we face is that about 40% of those children are going to arrive in first grade, unless we set high expectations, not ready and able to learn to read. And so the governor's charge to us was very simple. Lots of good services out there, lots of good programs, no absence of goodwill, intelligence, and energy in this state. However, we have to take different actions than we are currently taking to achieve the goal of having those children land in first grade ready to read. And why is that important? Well, it's important because if you think about it, if those children are not ready to read and don't learn to read, our ability to have an employable workforce goes away. And that's a critical component to the economy of the state and to our future. So, what he asked us to do is to come up with some metrics to achieve that. Now, one of the things that's been fascinating about that process is people keep thinking we have something behind the curtain that we're going to pull out, and here's the panacea, and here's how we're getting it done. It's a design team. We're creating that design. In fact, we're creating it tomorrow from 9 to 2 p.m. in Salem, and any of you who want to come watch that excitement, you're welcome to join us. But we're going to create a design that uses all of the metrics that we've talked about today: data sets, budgets, integration of services, crisp focus on outcomes and results, integration, and most importantly, a family focus, to design a framework so that this can occur in Oregon, using all the tremendous resources we have in the state today: commissions on children and family, Head Start, early Head Start, medical resources, etc. What we're asked to do is to integrate those resources in new and exciting ways to deliver a result that is measurable and shows up in the classroom so that the governor's 0 through 20 education initiative goals can be attained, and we think we can do that. Let me talk just briefly about differential response. First of all, when I first heard about differential response, it sounded to me like a military term. I was like, what does that mean? You know, does that mean, what are we talking about? Differential response is an example of what Erinn is doing to make sure that we are meeting the needs of children and families, and that we are accountable for doing that, and that we can show results at the end of the effort. I want to give you a concrete example of a differential response. There are flyers on the table outside the door about Oregon Intercept. Oregon Intercept is a differential response. Several years ago, Christie, the organization I lead, had some pretty serious challenges with reimbursement rates and services, et cetera, and so we did two really smart things. I have a very skilled board of directors. We went out and found some really smart financial people, and they told us we had a structural deficit, and we dealt with that. The other thing we did is we said, who are the best in the country at doing this work? Let's find them. Let's talk to them. Let's see how they do everything, including, I love the discussion of implementation science, because I'm one of those people who has, you know, a lot of energy and ideas, but it's getting it done that is the real art form. So we found youth villages. We'd worked with them. We have the same treatment philosophy as youth villages. But we kind of hunkered down with them on a very intense level of detail and said, According to the Harvard Business Journal, the White House, Casey Family Programs, you are getting the best results in the country. How can we get the best results in the country? And we began aggressively to convert what we were doing to their model with the discipline that they bring. And the Oregon Intercept program, which began in Washington and Clackamas counties in March, is an example of a differential response. We go into families' homes. We don't take kids out. We want to help those families. And we give those families a single point of accountability. We give them all the supports they need 24/7, and I mean 24/7 because I'm on the phone sometimes at 2 in the morning and I know what 24/7 means. But we make sure that those families get everything they need and their children so that they can be successful, so that they can finish their education, so that they can go into the workforce, so that they can pay their heating bill. We're going to incorporate in Governor Kitzhaber's early design team some of those principles, and we're also going to incorporate some of the tools that are developed nationally to help us get this work done. And what are those tools? First and foremost, if we are looking at change in a resource-constrained environment, we have got to look at improved budget methodologies. There are many of them. I love budgets. There are lots of better ways to do it than the way we are currently doing it. We're going to look at data systems. I can't believe we live in the Silicon Forest, and I sit in meetings every day talking about we don't have integrated data. You can't make informed decisions in a complex society without data systems. We're going to use them. We're going to look at performance-based contracting. We're going to look at paying for results. We have lots of good people doing good work. Let's pay them. As Erinn said, let's pay them more for getting great results, but let's pay for performance. And finally, we're going to look at client-level outcomes. We're going to look at results. What about those 40% of kids that we need ready to read in first grade so that we can have the best economy in the country? So, I want to conclude by saying I'd like everyone to think first of all about what your expectations are as an Oregonian. The Oregon I grew up in had very high expectations for every single one of the members of our population. Let's get back there. Number two, change is tough. I would be the first person to tell you that I haven't been bonding nearly enough with my treadmill for the last 8 months while I have been bringing significant change to my organization. I would also tell you it's the most important work I've ever done in my life in terms of what it means for children and families every day in Oregon. So let's commit ourselves to the hard work. Let's commit ourselves to those high expectations. Thank you.
Before I introduce our Friday Forum host, if you have written a question on one of those index cards, now is the time to hold it up and City Club staff will come around and collect them. The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from our Friday Forum host, City Club Governor Steve Rosenbaum. Steve is president and CEO of Pop Art, an interactive marketing agency, and he has been a club member since 2009. Steve?
I've been a club member since 2002. Okay. Lynne, as you were telling me prior to your talk that you were going through a merger between Christie Care and Youth Villages. What were some of the considerations about having the merger occur, and what were some of the challenges and early successes you're seeing from it?
Thank you. The considerations were first and foremost in this order. Christie Care is 151 years old. We may be Oregon's oldest charity, and we are a devoutly mission-driven organization. So first, mission comes first with us. It always has. We find that alignment in Youth Villages. Second of all, in advancing the cause of families, although we are a mental health provider, our cause is families. Our focus is families. What we wanted to identify were best practice national solutions to the challenges that families face, so we had that alignment. Third, we understood that 2008 was a reset, and that what we needed to do was to look at every possible efficiency and initiative that we could participate in that would drive more dollars directly into service as opposed to overhead expense, and the merger met that objective as well.
As always, now we're going to take questions from the floor, and this is going to include at least one of the index card questions that were delivered today. So if you're a City Club member, you can come up to the microphone here at my right. Please, before you ask your question, identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less. Folks who are here regularly know that I have a question mark card that I'm not shy about holding up if you haven't gotten to your question. I'm going to start with one of the questions from the index cards. Is the current economy producing significant opportunities to recruit better employees and leaders to careers in human services? And if so, how are you all taking advantage of it?
I'll start. I think my first instinct in terms of a response was that yes, coming into Oregon budgets on a 2-year budget cycle for state agencies, and coming into the last 2-year budget cycle to catch up with the demand for service, the legislature approved our department having some additional staff, which we did hire, and we were very fortunate, I think, to be able in this environment to recruit some of the best and brightest to the human service arena within our department. The challenge that we've had is that because of the budget decline that's been we've been experiencing for the last couple of years, that recruitment for the good happened in terms of our direct service delivery. So the individuals who are on the front lines were those that we continue to prioritize in our agency, those people providing direct service to Oregonians. We have been in a hiring freeze, however, for about a year. And so we're not currently able to benefit from the economic environment, and people currently who are working for us who are really well qualified, and now as the economy is in recovery, there are more opportunities for them. We're now seeing leave at higher levels, and so we have some folks that are leaving that we're disappointed to lose, and we have no ability to fill behind them.
Steve Arnold, City Club member. I very much agree that quality of service is important. I also see attempts to measure outcomes with some limited success. I've also hear from social service organization employees complaints of cultural problems in their organizations. Deming, the founder of Quality Management, said that the key to quality in an organization is the behavior of its management. How is the behavior of management of state contracted organizations being monitored and evaluated?
I share your commitment to quality management and to supporting the workforce. By the way, Christie Care is hiring, and we welcome any. We have great people crossing our path these days. We take very seriously the oversight that we receive. We're regulated by about 15 entities on a regular basis, and they look at everything from what time I arrive for work in the morning to every safety feature of our operation. So I think we operate at a very high level of quality. I will tell you that part of the reason we're so enthusiastic about our merger with Youth Villages is they have made a significant investment, unparalleled, in training and supporting their workforce in a way that frankly we have not been able to do, and they also are very committed to measuring outcomes for their clients at 6, 12, and 24-month intervals. So they actually know what those investments in the workforce translate into in terms of children and families they serve.
Steve Novick, City Club member. My question is for Ben. One could argue that our criminal justice system is like our healthcare system. We pay for triple bypass surgeries. We pay for long periods of incarceration. We don't pay for enough prevention in either system. The Pew Center recently did a study that said that there's no incentive for prosecutors to send people away for less than the maximum, because if a given county asks for lower sentences, they don't get any of the saved money back. They thought that's a problem. What would you think about creating a state public safety funding system that would kind of treat local jurisdictions as coordinated crime organizations and tell them, here is your global budget for public safety. You can choose to prove it, but to spend it on sending people to our prisons, or you could spend less on prisons, more on prevention. You decide. What do you think about developing a model like that?
Well, I mean, I would go back to my comment about implementation science. I think in concept, it makes an awful lot of sense. The question is, it sounds very, very complicated. The politics sound radioactive. And the question is it reasonable to assume that you could ever do such a thing? In principle, I like it. In practice, I don't think it would go very far. That's just my opinion.
Hi, Jerry Cohn, City Club member, and first of all, thank all three speakers for your leadership. And having just returned from a conference on change and particularly healthcare, you hit something, a theme that I thought was important. Bright spots was the speaker from Stanford Business School. I'm spacing out on the author's name, but bottom line was talking about clarity, of highlighting best practices, clarity and simplicity and ease, particularly for those we wish to be assisting and supporting in community. So I'm directing the question actually to Erinn. I'll get to the question now. Erinn, I know that, and I hope it was not an oversight, that you also are responsible with the department with a population that is as valued as all, a family, aging and people with disabilities. Seniors, we call seniors, although I don't know how old is old. I work for AARP, so that 50 plus, I don't know. Give me the letter. So tell me a little bit more in terms of where the bright spot, Oregon is seen for the rest of the country as a bright spot. We've shown incredible savings in avoiding long-term care, facility care until absolutely needed, and it helps family and caregivers. Many of us boomers are dealing with those issues, and our children and grandchildren as well. Can you talk a little bit more about how this all fits into bright spots and how we are going to be addressing change and reset?
Thank you, Jerry. I appreciate the question because I had two other bright spots I wanted to share, but I went over time a little bit. One, I won't get to unless someone wants to ask me about developmental disability services, but Jerry's absolutely right. We also serve our aging population and people with physical disabilities, and Oregon is a bright spot nationally, and the financial challenges we're facing from the point of view of some, are threatening our ability to continue doing what we've done. We are nationally recognized for serving people in their own homes and in their communities before, and primarily and helping them to avoid more costly nursing facility settings, and we want to continue that. I think the next best bright spot for Oregon when it comes to seniors and people with disabilities in our services is really focusing on aging and disability resource connections. 33 other states have done this, so we're nationally leading in terms of our long-term care system. We're a little behind in terms of shifting our focus more toward that preventive model, where we do things like provide financial counseling, options counseling to the entirety of our senior population, and we don't just focus on the 3% that end up in publicly funded services. That 3% costs us a lot, and if you look at our demographic trends over the next couple of years, more people in Oregon are getting old. No surprise there. And more older people are living longer. And so we will continue to be financially challenged to maintain our current excellent long-term care system if we're not able to have different kinds of conversations with families and caregivers. We need a single trusted place for people to pick up the phone, go online, and get good information about what their choices are, how to prevent falls, how to be healthy individuals, both in terms of physical health and financial health going into their older years. We don't currently have that. As Lynne observed in the kids system, we have a lot of really great people out there doing really good work, but it's not accessible. I think that was an important word that Ben used. Our job with these resource connections is to make the information more accessible to people and set some clear goals, like we don't want to have more than 3% of our population accessing Medicaid long-term care services, even as our population that is older is getting larger.
Kurt Wabring, member. In 1983, the city and the county got together and created something called Resolution A, which basically said the county will do social services, the city will do streets, parks, sewers, etc. Right from the start, according to the Portland Tribune, there's been a creep on the city side to do more social services. The city auditor has just come out with a report saying that we should go back to this distinction between county social services, city urban services. Is that a step forward or is it a step backwards? Do you get the drift?
Yes, I was there in 1983. I was actually doing work with the city and the county. So I think it is really important in times of limited resources, which those are the times we live in and will be for some time, to really be careful about who's doing what, not only who's doing what, but how much are you spending doing what. I'm very focused right now on looking at overhead assessments across continuums of care because that makes a big difference in getting money to children and families or others. So I would strongly encourage and applaud, and I think some of this work is underway, certainly on the county side, I'm aware of it, but the city and the county to be very crisp and clear about who's doing what exactly so that there isn't duplication of effort. As Ben said, that's one of the first things in a resource-constrained environment you need to be clear about and sort out, because otherwise you're just, you're spending money you don't need to spend.
I might add to that, I think it would be a huge mistake to spend too much intellectual energy sorting out which level of government should provide service in some misguided assumption that it makes a difference. I think the reality is that you have city administered systems in places like New York and certainly in the District of Columbia. You have California as a county administered system. Washington and Oregon are state administered systems. They all do things well and they all do things poorly. So burning up resources, moving the boxes around is seductive, and Lord knows we've done a lot of it. If you think back, if that were an answer, all the moving around that we've done for the last 30 years would have given us a near perfect system by now. So that I would argue strongly that we focus in on the quality of what families receive and not on the conveyance system.
Another of our index card questions is, what is the role of the churches in this transformation that we need to tackle?
I'll start to speak to that a bit. I think that community organizations broadly, including the faith-based community, have a really important role to play that often we neglect. And we've been very fortunate at the Department of Human Services to have at our tables members of the faith community sitting with us, talking with us about their parishioners and members of their congregations. They have the same goals that we do. They want those members to be safe and healthy and living independently. And I have been profoundly impacted by the willingness of the church community to be involved. I'll give you an example. In the foster care arena, since we spent some time on that today, we had a circumstance with a family where government had responded to a phone call regarding domestic violence. The children and the mother were not safe in the home. They had no place to go. They had no extended family or community here they were connected to. And we were interested in not removing the children from the mother. The mother was wanting to be protective of her children. She just couldn't do that with her batterer present. So we put them up in a hotel. We have a limited amount of flexible resource to do that. And we kept putting them up in a hotel. And we were getting nervous because the mother still had no place to go. None of our search for resources in the community had played out in terms of housing or other availability. So we picked up the phone and we called one of the local churches. And that day, they moved her into an apartment and paid her first 3 months' rent. We then were able to spend our limited resource on supports for her that were other than putting her up in a hotel, and she has since stably been in that placement for the last 9 months, paying her own rent and taking care of her own kids. And without that phone call, that never would have happened.
We have run out of time for further questions and will have to stop for today. There will be no forum next week in honor of Memorial Day weekend, but please do join us on June 3rd for a talk by United States Senator Jeff Merkley. And as we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation to today's guests, Ben DeHaan, Erinn Kelley-Siel, and Lynne Saxton. We're adjourned.